From the keyboard to the boardroom, this is the Business of Esports podcast.
The fastest growing entertainment phenomenon of this generation.
Hi, Prophet of Esports, joined today by my friend and co-host William Collis.
Yeah, we got the book of Esports out. It's a big deal.
So everyone knows me as the Prophet and William as the Professor.
They may call me the Prophet, but in my life outside of the business of esports, I have worked on the investment side of the table for the better part of the last 2 decades. The single fastest growing area of gaming and esports is gambling. It's booming right now. You don't need to be a prophet like me to see that. However, as an investor, I've stayed away from gambling and betting companies because of the reputational risk and often shady nature of the companies involved. This was true until now. I've recently bought stock in a new public company called Esports Entertainment Group, or EEG, which is focused on esports and gambling. The big difference that changed my mind is that EEG is a public company, NASDAQ listed, and fully regulated, focused on esports betting. The regulatory and audit requirements of a public company are key in my mind to provide the needed transparency for players, bettors, and investors. I had an opportunity to host the CEO of EEG on this podcast a couple of months ago, and I was very impressed by his vision for the company. We've stayed in touch, and I'm delighted to announce that they've accepted to become a sponsor of the podcast. If you're a family office, institutional investor, or investor of any kind, really, Esports Entertainment Group, ticker symbol GAMBLE, GMBL, might be one of the best ways to get exposure to the esports betting space and gaming in general. Make sure to check them out at esportsentertainmentgroup.com. Having said that, I need to make sure to state that this is only my opinion. I'm not an investment advisor or selling stock in the company. Please make sure you do your own research and seek advice from a licensed professional if you're looking to invest in the field. From the keyboard to the boardroom, this is the Business of Esports podcast. I am Paul Doalibi. I'm joined today by my friend and co-host, William Collis.
Yep.
For those of you who are new to the podcast, welcome to the official podcast of esports. What we do here is we cover the most pressing gaming and esports topics and news of the week, but we look at all of it through a business and C-suite lens. We dissect, we analyze the business implications of everything happening in this industry. For our regular listeners, thank you guys for tuning in every week. Thank you for all the love, the 5-star ratings and reviews. Thank you for telling your friends about the podcast. If you haven't already, tell your friend, tell a colleague, spread the word. If you love listening to the podcast, tell someone else about it. This is how we've grown our audience, and we thank you guys for it. Also, if you haven't already, go buy William's book, The Book of Esports, on Amazon. You can go buy it right now. You'll probably have it tomorrow if you go order it right now. And if you've already read the book or you've already bought the book, do William a favor and go leave a review. Tell him how much you loved it on Amazon. I know he would appreciate it. William, how's it going?
It's going really well, Paul. It's been another brutal week, busy week, but excited that I get to, honestly, these podcast recordings are just my favorite time ever with you. It's just so fun. I don't know, guys, for anyone who's listening to this and wonders, do they fake the rapport or anything? Or is it no, this is 100% what we're like. And it's 100% what we're like before and after recording. It's just the Paul and William banter is real. So I don't know. It's great.
We get to geek out over games and business for an hour and not worry about anything else. I mean, it's kind of a fun thing.
That's right. And we got some spicy stories today, some fun stuff to cover. And I think this podcast, has actually some bigger picture issues that I think are kind of interesting. So it'll be fun to touch on those and maybe have a slightly tonally different podcast than we normally do. So let's see how it goes. But first, we got to open with a really fun story, right, Paul?
Yeah, we have a bit of a silly story, which I think we both agreed would be just kind of fun to open with because of the nature of the story. And fundamentally, the story was, again, it's an esports story, but it's interesting because of what actually took place here. So just a bit of background. I'll show you guys the headline, or I'll read you the headline here if you're listening to this podcast. It's Florida Tech's Funk Textile Museum to become esports arena, generating mixed reviews. And the gist of the story here is that this person, Funk, who is a philanthropist who died, donated $1.25 million to Florida Tech to build her namesake facility. And it was going to be the first and only textile museum of its stature in Florida. Now, budgetary woes sort of hit this textile museum hard. And now Florida Tech, which is very STEM focused, is converting this textile museum to an esports arena, much to the dismay of Funk's descendants. And so it's kind of a fun story. It's like, I don't know, William, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, this is an interesting one for me, because for me, this is really like a, there's a reason why we decided to put it in. It's like it shows you how times change. You know what I mean? Because I think it's easy to hear the words textile museum today and kind of think, oh, that's such a dated, like antiquated concept. But like, honestly, textile was one of the major manufacturing industries for most of, basically modern history. And it's still incredibly important to the global economy. It's still a huge industry, right? But it also shows you how, like, esports is seeping in other places and displacing these old, what candidly do sound more antiquated. They're maybe not, but like their esports is kind of pushing its way in. And I think it's sort of a funny story, particularly to see it here, like taking over a textile museum, because it's sort of this very nice parable of like, here's the new kid on the block, like get this other stuff out. I also think it's kind of an interesting thing to think about too, because it shows how, basically resources are being reallocated to reflect the new economy. You know what I mean? As I said, textiles are like incredibly important to American history and global history, right? And it's so funny to see like an esports arena be something that's strong enough and compelling enough to push, or at least for decision makers to feel like it's worth pushing out that, regardless of the mixed reviews it's been getting. So, and apologies, I know it must. If I donated all that money to have a textile museum in my name and it turned into an esports arena, I'd be pretty upset. But
yeah, I mean, quite. I understand why they're upset, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it's interesting also in the context of the other discussions we've had around esports and colleges or universities, and I think particularly interesting because a lot of these private schools are not strapped for cash, but they're all they're all coming under pressure to sort of justify every investment and focus on areas that will drive real revenue and real growth for the university, right? And I think what we're seeing is this is a perfect example of a university looking at their bottom line going, this esports thing is going to drive more applicants to come to Florida Tech. And so it's kind of a no-brainer, right? It's way better driver of revenue than a textile museum. And I think good universities are all realizing that. And this story is funny because where we've seen many examples of universities building new facilities or committing to new facilities, I think this is the first one where it's like, hey, you guys, like, get out of here. We're using
replacement. It's like, well, that building could probably be used for, anything else, something else.
So, it's just another, I think, sign of this trend, which I think will only accelerate of every, reputable college and university in the country having both academic programs and facilities for people to play and compete. Because that's what's going to attract people to their, especially STEM focused like universities like Florida Tech. It's doubly important, I think. So it's an interesting but a fun story. And although we feel sorry for Funk's descendants.
Yeah, it does. It's unfortunate. I mean, like I said, as much as it's sort of funny to make light of it, it is tough, because that's presumably that person made a hugely significant contribution to the school, and you would wish that the school could have found another way to achieve this end, right? Like, esports didn't want to take over the textile museum. It seems like that was the directive of the school, but yeah.
Let's move on, William. That was kind of a fun, light one
for
to
a
start.
serious story.
This is way more serious. Actually, probably about as serious as it gets on this podcast.
Okay.
And this is an article about Tencent. The headline here is China's Tencent in talks with US to keep gaming investments. And the gist of the story is Tencent obviously owns Riot Games, and they own a big chunk of Epic Games. And they've been in talks with the Committee on Foreign Investment, which basically has the authority to force Tencent to divest these U.S. holdings. And so now Tencent's essentially trying to work with this committee to figure out how they can keep these ownership stakes in these U.S. game developers, right? So they own majority of Riot, or 100% of Riot, I think at this point, and a 40% stake in Epic. And there's real risk here for Tencent. Supposedly they have negotiated risk mitigating measures with the committee, and they're currently negotiating, to keep them. So, William, I'm curious your thoughts on this, without getting into any politics, obviously. But, could Tencent be in trouble at some point because of everything they have amassed, and so it starts to raise red flags?
Yeah. I mean, this is a really potentially significant problem for it's an existential risk for their business, right? Do you know what I mean? Like, if you think about, like all the success that company has had in gaming, right? And let's be honest, it's had a phenomenal amount of success, particularly in the esports sphere of gaming. I mean, we basically, I think we pretty much, rightly or wrongly, impute real genius to Tencent, right?
Yeah.
At least, certainly, the success they've seemed to have seems to indicate genius. The reality is, there are existential risks to businesses like Tencent's. And one of them is, in this multinational heavy investment strategy, are you going to be allowed to, is government regulation a problem, right? Can government regulation come in and disrupt you? And it's weird for us to think about government regulation being an issue in video games, right? Because it sort of doesn't, it's like video games, come on, like government, like what are we, we haven't done anything about loot boxes yet, like what's happening. But because of the value, I mean, you've seen just so many businesses we've talked about on the podcast achieving billions of billion-dollar valuations, right? They're such big targets, and they have so much foreign money coming into them because they're so, games are such a fungible global commodity, right? Like, you can launch, if you have a game that works in North America, chances are it'll probably be pretty good in Europe, Australia, Asia, everywhere, right? And the ability to diffuse that product is relatively easy too, because it's digital, right? So as long as you have internet in your home country, and yes, there's, localization and everything, but fundamentally it's much easier than, say, shipping cars around, right?
Yeah.
So the reality is it makes games, I think, even more of an attractive market for foreign investment because the product itself is so fundamentally decentralized, if you want to think about it that way, right? So yeah, it's scary, and I think Tencent, you gotta be worried because let me be clear. I don't think they're going to be forced to divest their ownership of Riot Games or Epic Games, right? I don't think that's likely. I do think what's interesting here, though, is what prohibition strictures or gives Tencent makes to U.S. regulators to be able to keep those positions in the companies. Because the reality is, once you're sitting down at the table, they're going to lose something here. I think something's going to be extracted from them. The question is, what is it going to be? And it's interesting to think, is it an opportunity for mirrored investment in, related domestic companies that are domestic to Tencent Smart? That's an interesting option. It's interesting to think, are there going to be strictures in terms of the control they can exert on their, US-based investments? That will be interesting, particularly in light of the fact that I wonder, there seems to be so much independence today from Riot Games and Epic, right? Makes you wonder if, maybe like control was never an issue, but maybe now it gets formalized, but it'll be very interesting to watch. I think it's going to be very important because Tencent's money is it's a significant portion of the money driving the industry today. So whatever happens for them, it's going to dictate how they can invest in future as well. And this could actually have a cooling effect on some of the game stuff that we've seen.
Yeah, I was going to ask that question. Like, do you think this makes them more gun shy or,
It's tough because you've had so much success with the strategy, right? Like, you've made so much money. Like, there's now a problem. And like I said, I don't think this is, though it's a potential catastrophic business risk, I would just be amazed if there's a forced divestiture or something here. It just doesn't seem likely to me.
Well,
right?
and what do you think they're going to have to give? What do you, like, if you had to, I know you threw out some options there, but what do you think? How do you think this plays out?
I just don't. It's difficult to speculate, but I think it'll be something to do about control and corporate governance, right? And a limited ability to influence companies. So maybe an inability to vote some of their shares or something. I think that'll be a part of it. I also wonder if there's I can't imagine it'd be much more than that. I can't even really see a cap being put in place on the ownership stake they could take or something for future investments, right? Both because they. It doesn't seem to be how we do business today, but also it's very rare that they're buying 100% of things like Riot Games. Most of what they have is very significant, but still minority positions like what they hold in Epic. So I think that's right. I don't know. What do you think?
I'm curious. Do you think if any of this was any of this conversation around, divesting these U.S. assets was accelerated by this news from last week that we discussed, where Valorant, a Riot Games game, Valorant voice communications are all being recorded. And, maybe this raised some red flags. It's, hey, this is a security issue. We can't have, the Chinese listening to everything we're saying.
Yeah. I mean, in general, I think games are a potential, games have incredible, because they're just, think how often and also, by the way, think how much communication, you do through games, it's, and game related, products, like we've talked about Discord in the past and how much Discord gets used for things, right? I think the reality though is, if you're going to be picking on businesses based on their control and monitoring, games might be a good place to start, but it feels like the mobile market is the place to really begin. I think it's probably the apps that are the higher risk, because let's be honest, like League of Legends is an amazing game and hugely significant, but its ability to know what I'm doing, I'm guessing, is far lessened than, say, the ability of dozens of apps on my phone, which are basically designed around data collection. I'm not saying Riot doesn't do a lot of sophisticated data collection. I presume they do, as we've talked about on the podcast before. But I think their ability to access is more gated, I would imagine. So yeah, I don't think it's related, but it would be interesting if it was. And it would certainly highlight sort of the regulatory scrutiny that's being placed in general on gaming. I think, by the way, has sort of had regulatory scrutiny due for it for a long time. I think when
you think it's overdue.
Overdue, yeah. I don't think it's going to be heavy regulation, but things like loot boxes, I'm still amazed we don't have movement there. You know what I mean? Again, it's a personal opinion, but it would seem to me something that you might want to look at least having some government guidelines for around this. I think games have just been for so long perceived as what kids play in basements and silly little industry, and we don't really, come on, that's, it's highways and airplanes, and but the reality is the money is so large now. Money attracts attention. I think there's gonna be, my prediction for the back half of this year is we'll probably see more stories, not aggressive, scary stories, but more stories about things being looked at in the space, because I think there will be some changes here coming. What do you think, Paul? I'm curious. What's your take on this? Well, what do you think Tencent would have to give here?
Good question. I think I'm with you on, probably, if anything, because I actually think there probably won't be anything. If I had to guess, I don't think there will be any repercussions here for Tencent. I don't think anything will change. I think this is mostly ceremonial, or it's we have to make it seem like we're looking at it and we're thinking about it, and I really don't think they're going to end up with any kind of repercussions. And if anything, I'm totally with you on maybe it's a governance issue. I think the more interesting conversation that I like to sort of theorize about, or if I put my tinfoil hat on, right? If this does go through, right, and Tencent is forced to divest these assets.
What? That's really, I didn't even think about that, because I was like, that would not happen.
Where do they go?
Yeah. Well, what their whole strategy is, I mean, and what would that mean for the global gaming landscape, right? I mean, it would, probably, like, and this is a real reach, but it would probably be a return more to historical norms, right? If you think about how gaming used to be in the 80s and 90s, right? There was a lot more regionalized manufacture. You had things like Japanese consoles that were basically only had games made for them in Japan by Japanese companies, right? I mean, I'm extremely, simplifying there, but that's what immediately jumps to my mind. Like the PlayStation era, where it was like rare for, or like even early Nintendo era, right? It was rare for foreign developers to be producing a lot for Japanese domestic consoles. For various reasons, like the Nintendo Seal of Quality program or other things. I wonder if you wouldn't see more regionalization, again, as a result of that, because it's just tougher for money to be international. And funnily enough, I wonder if that might bring back more console exclusivity, like as a really strange knock-on effect. Because if you think about it, what you're really saying is development budgets are probably going to have to get smaller. They're going to have to be maybe more, there's going to be more risk because there's less money to flow into studios and things. You might want partnerships with, large platforms like an Xbox or a PlayStation to play the role of an investor almost and diffuse some of the risk. So it'd be interesting.
Yeah.
You might see us, I mean, I'm really reaching here to be interesting, but like one possible world, if you walk through that mirror of Tencent is forced to divest, one possible world we end back up in is the 90s. And another console war, it'll be modern, it might be more platform-based, all these other things, but that could be where you end up going.
Yeah, you may see more like smaller studios just in greater quantity also.
Exactly,
But I think the interesting thought is
multi-title studios and more of, sort of what it used to be where, studios had 1 to 2 IPs and, they were just focused on sequeling or I mean, paradoxically, I wonder if it might in some sense have more innovation in the industry, because again, there's sort of this trade-off with the more money that flows in, the more risk averse the industry gets because the more cost of failure goes up, right?
Yep.
So again, maybe thinking about the 90s and like Looking Glass Studios and Thief the Dark Project might not be the weirdest world to think about. But to be very clear, I do not think it would be overall good for the industry to have a forced divestiture here. It would have a cooling effect. It would overall be very negative, and it might be some interesting knock-ons. And it's always fun to think about going back to the 90s and Gushers after school snacks, that's my memory. So
what's interesting is who buys Riot in a divestiture situation, right? And the name I inevitably come to is it's got to be Activision Blizzard.
Well,
right? Because they're Tencent friendly.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Why not pass it along to a friend?
I mean, that would be the greatest. Paul, I refuse to think about that world because what does that mean for Heroes of the Storm?
Yeah, this is true.
What does that mean for Heroes of the Storm?
Maybe Heroes of the Storm gets a fighting chance at that point. I don't know.
No. I think what would happen is you'd start having Blizzard skins popping up in League of Legends, and Heroes of the Storm would be done. It would be scary. No, but you're right. But why wouldn't Riot go public in that world just to speculate?
Maybe.
That's
Possibly.
what I would suggest, because if I'm Tencent and if I'm Riot and I'm looking at this and I'm saying, look, like Activision Blizzard's a public company, like look how well, like it's our time, they're large enough, they have a multi-title suite, right? They're no longer, a one game company, right? Which they were for most of their history. They arguably have, and we thought sort of Riot might be preparing to go public on the podcast historically, right? Like we talked about that with their, big multi-game, long-term plan and, diversified channel strategy. They were doing all the things that made sense before a public offering. I would bet that rather than be acquired, they would go public, particularly with today's market and the valuations game company.
I mean, that would be this would be a ridiculously hyped like IPO too, right? Like we're talking way bigger than Roblox, way bigger than, you know.
Yeah, well, not only that, but just think of what the Robin Hood effect would have on this.
Everyone
can
wants
you
to own
imagine
League
if-
of Legends.
Yeah, the 100 million players who play League of Legends all decide they want to put in a week's allowance into the company. That's $1 billion of capital right there. You know, like right there, right? Assuming your allowance is $10 a week, which I don't know, maybe it's more nowadays. I don't know, or less. I have no idea. But I mean, that it's crazy. I mean, actually talking about it makes me wonder, like, why aren't they public? It would seem like they'd get, I guess, you know, the pains, the strictures of being a public company, but it seemed like they would get such a favorable reception in the market, right?
Yeah, but this is why, like, last week's news scared me so much, in the sense that being public invites scrutiny. Right? When you're private and owned by Tencent, good luck, like, knowing what they're actually doing or what, right? So maybe they just don't want the public scrutiny either.
Well, you know, to some extent, and I'm not going to, I don't want to cast any aspersions here. I want to be difficult about how I phrase it, but, like, I think the fact that Riot hasn't gone public sort of explains why Riot still makes very good games, right? Because
True.
I'm not saying you can't be a public company and make great games. Like, obviously there are a million counterexamples to that, but it shows where the focus of the management team is, right? Like and candidly, there are probably a lot of incentives to be public, but if your goal is to make the best competitive games, which I think is probably how Riot would describe their business model, right? You're right. You know, you have enough money, you're well funded, you're doing well, you don't actually need access to the capital, which is the big reason to go public, right? It might be more rewarding and more intellectually satisfying to stay private and have the flexibility and the control and all the things that you give up a little bit. So, yeah, I don't know. It's interesting.
Yeah, and it's again, it's one of those things where, you know, I'm not suggesting they're doing anything nefarious with the data, but you just don't want prying eyes. And because they've looked at, you can look at Blizzard, right, and go, look what being public did for them. I mean, practically.
Well, you know, that's not. I don't want to go into the Blizzard conversation again, but I was looking at the.
They may look at it that way. If you're a developer, right? If you're just the guy, forget about management, forget about, like, if you're just the guy making games, right?
Yeah.
You probably know people at Blizzard who are not happy. It's why you have this sort of exodus of people there, and you're going, maybe we're better off the way we are, where they don't care how long it takes. They're focused on making a good game, right? They have no shareholders to answer to every quarter. They don't have, right? It's There's a lot of upside to staying private.
There's huge upside to staying private, and particularly because at the end of the day, you know, I wouldn't describe Riot's goals as artistic, because even if many people in the company would, because I think it's more, I think of them less as artists and more as craftsmen, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Like, I think what they're doing is, like, they're just, you know, it's not like they're trying to do this crazy, you know, non-commercially. Like, they're honing this thing again and again and again. It's like a wood carver.
They're not trying to win Oscars.
Exactly.
Right? But they're going to build a really cool house.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think if you have that craftsman mentality where you want to bake titles for 10 years and cancel projects that you don't think are going to work out, and have random development teams work on things that never, you know, all the things that you kind of associate, like, I guess you could say the old Activision Blizzard with, right? You know, or the old Blizzard, right? Like, yeah, just why would you want to invite that whole situation? I mean, look at the headache that Blizzard's with right now with the launch of Diablo 4. Like, you know.
And Overwatch 2.
And Overwatch 2. Why would you want to invite that?
Yeah.
You know, nobody was asking for Valorant until Valorant just appeared. You know?
It's true. It's true. It's a good point.
But if they'd been a public company, the question would have been, where's the next game? Where's the next game? Where's the next game? We've been waiting. Guys, it's been 5 years. Come on. Yeah.
Yeah, you previewed whatever, that fighting game, you know, 6 months ago. We want it now. Where is it, right?
Yeah, and there's also the lesson of CDPR now, too, in the market, looking at this, which is, look, you know, you could have argued they were the model for a publicly traded auteur company. And, yeah, you know, Cyberpunk, I wonder, would Cyberpunk have released when it did had they not been a public company trying to hit holiday sales? I mean, I'm sorry to say it, but, like,
it's a good point.
You have to think that played a factor in it, you know?
Yep.
Anyway.
Let's move on to another publisher here. because this one's also an interesting story, William, and I know you were excited to talk about some of the repercussions of this, but this was from Reuters, and the headline here is Ubisoft invests in free-to-play games, signals profits might fall. So Ubisoft warned that their financial year, that profits might fall this financial year, and that they may look to create new free-to-play titles. So, they have some existing free-to-play games, but their view, and I'll just read this quote directly. It's now time to come up with high-quality free-to-play games across all our biggest franchises, across all platforms, but of course it will take time. So I think there's this interesting, and this you keyed in on this right away, William, and so I'm just going to borrow it.
Yeah, you're just going to steal it from me.
I am. There's this interesting dichotomy here of, warning about profits falling, but then simultaneously saying we want to do more free to play. Can you explain how we reconcile those seemingly two things that are opposing?
Yeah, because if you think about it intuitively, can you imagine a company 10 years ago saying this, we're not making as much money. The solution is to give more stuff away, right? You'd be like if this were, back in the, early 2000s, you'd be like, oh, I'm really worried about that. That seems like a terrible management choice. But two things. One is it shows, it's so many things, right? One is it shows the power, how commonly accepted free-to-play is as a business model today, and how basically clearly assumed it is in the industry that free-to-play is a path to high revenues, not, giving away quality games, right? So it's really interesting in that regard, right? Yep. Two is it shows you companies being forced to migrate more and more free-to-play, right? Because the interesting thing here is this isn't like if it were the scenario where profits were record up, so we're doing more free-to-play development, you can't it wouldn't have the same impact as this is a solution. Basically, the companies that are all doing well right now have very significant free-to-play staples. And the companies that maybe are anticipating, saying, I'm not saying Ubisoft isn't doing very well. It's a great company. But, if they're anticipating a profit fall, they're almost being forced to do more free-to-play to combat that. So it's interesting that the mechanism is there to push free-to-play more and more. The third thing I would say is, it is interesting how many large successful publishers still don't have the suite of free-to-play titles that you would think make sense given these two trends we just described, right? Look at Call of Duty. Call of Duty did not have free-to-play until, what was it, this year? Last year, right? Basically last year.
Warzone. When Warzone came out. A year and a half, maybe?
Year and a half, yeah. That's crazy. That is crazy. And think of all the amazing games that amazing games. I can just tell you, Ubisoft's done some of my favorite titles of all time. Mirror's Edge. No, Mirror's Edge was EA. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. That was DICE. But they did Prince of Persia, right? Which I just, to this day, I absolutely love that title. I think
Assassin's Creed 655.
Yeah.
How
Watch
many thousand Assassin's Creed
which
games?
I know is, maybe not. But they make brilliant games, right? And isn't it crazy that actually Assassin's Creed, isn't it crazy that there isn't a free-to-play Assassin's Creed offering in this day and age, right? Isn't it crazy that seems crazy to me? Because I know what you're going to say. Oh, it's a single-player experience. It's narrative-driven. Those games don't have that. And the answer I would have to that is then, look, your property Assassin's Creed is not it's so much more than just a narrative-driven historical game, right? It's a consumer base. It's a larger world. It's also a style of gameplay, and I can't imagine that not working well in a free-to-play model if you're smart and you think expansively about the title and what it can do. If you have a property that can tell stories in the future, in ancient Rome, and in Viking lands, I think you can figure out how to make some of that free to play somehow. You already have a pretty expansive, flexible IP there. And look, as much as I hate to say it, I think, and this is a weird example to cite, but even if you want more narrative-driven games, I think Grand Theft Auto and the success that's happened there with GTA Online points to how narrative-driven games can still have a second life with a post-monetization model that looks more like free-to-play, right?
Yeah, I think part of it is just they need to tell this story, right? Because you have, EA that crushed their earnings call, right? And a lot of the one thing they focused on more than anything was the growth in Apex.
Yep.
Right. And so if you're Ubisoft, you're going and you're looking at that going, well, we have to say we're doing something there too, right? You're sort of forced to play along because you're seeing your competitors have success with free to play. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, and I think it's so interesting that that's the forcing mechanism in the market today to free to play. I know I said that before. I just think it's so fascinating that that's the world we live in, that publishers are being made to migrate more and more into this model. So I hope people like free to play, because I think it's not just the wave of the future, it is the future. Anyway, keep going, Paul. Sorry.
No, the second point I was going to make is, and I know I'm going to get some pushback from you, but it's one of these situations where people want to go after sort of the easiest, or people want to get very cute and clever with the explanation, right? So growth is down, profits are down, but we're gonna fix it because we're gonna do more free to play, and this is the future, right? And
Love the future.
And no one sort of just sat back maybe and said, could it be not because of business models or anything else, but just because Ubisoft really hasn't made a very good game in a while, right? Maybe there's a simpler explanation here that has nothing to do with business model, that has nothing to do with free to play, and they're looking for sort of a fix and going, we'll just do a lot more free to play. And I just, as a, if I'm an investor or potential shareholder looking at, am I going to buy Ubisoft stock? I'm going, I don't know if that gives me comfort that they've solved the real problem here.
Well, but I am going to push back. First of all, I don't know if I agree with the statement they haven't made a good game recently. But let for the sake of the argument we want to make here, because I think this is interesting. Let's just say that's true. Let's say your opinion is true, and Ubisoft, the Assassin's Creed titles are just too similar to each other. There's consumer fatigue, right? Something like that, right?
Yeah.
Couldn't you argue, and I think it's kind of interesting, that part of the reason maybe why there's some struggle there is because the games themselves weren't free to play to begin with? And let me unpack that a little. Is I think it's very difficult to separate game design from game monetization, right? I think you have problems in game world when games are developed and then people figure out how to monetize them later, right? Games work when their monetization schema is fundamental to the development that precedes in the title itself, right? So maybe the fact that they're on an older monetization schema, when customers want a free-to-play experience that lets them sample more, that lets them have more customizable content, that maybe offers more self-expression, because let's be honest, cosmetics are such a huge piece of the free-to-play business model. Couldn't you argue that features that you think are maybe missing from Ubisoft titles today are missing because they started from a premise of it's a $60 retail box copy, and not this needs to be a long-term, persistent, microtransaction-driven experience? I'm not saying, I know people don't like microtransactions, but they lead to a style of game development that I think a lot of people like today. I think it's weird to say, but I think whether that's because we're used to it or because it's better, or I don't know, but I think people like it.
I mean, I like the argument, William, because I think that it's sound, but let's take it to its natural extreme here. Let's run it to the end of the course here. Okay,
let's not. But okay, yeah.
Which in my mind is okay. What you're basically saying is, if we make it free, people will have lowered expectations, and therefore subpar games will seem good in comparison, sort of thing, right? That's the 15,000th Assassin's Creed game, if it was free to play, might have been better received because it was cheap.
Well, no,
free.
No. I that's not the argument. It's not that free there's a lower perception of quality, so your game has to clear a lower bar. I think it changes the perceptual space a game exists in a more fundamental way. So let me use the example of Assassin's Creed. And again, the argument that, which I'm not sure I actually agree with, but let's just take it on premise that the Assassin's Creeds are too similar to each other year on year, right? Would you feel differently about it, Paul, if there was just the Assassin universe, right? And
Okay.
every 6 months, they were announcing a new historical period for you to go to. You could purchase it as a $4.99 pack with story expansions and alternate playable assassins, and it adds up to $100 instead of 60. But like, would you maybe instead of saying the game's too similar to each other, maybe you'd say, "Oh, it's so great how there's a new
content's
element
so
of world
fresh."
building. The content's so fresh. I love the way I was in Rome last week, and now I paid $5, and I'm in Greece now, or I'm in Valhalla or wherever.
It's
you
an
go in
interesting
Assassin's
thought.
Creed.
It's a good argument.
Like the point I'm making is like it literally like this like you could say like you could argue that I'll go back to Grand Theft Auto Online, which is the example I kind of hold up for the narrative driven parallel here. Like you could argue like that's been the same game for like 3 console cycles, but because of how it's presented and because of how snackable it is, it doesn't wear out its welcome in the same way. And in fact, the similarities are a positive because people can drop in, come back, reconsume, right? And the familiarity there, it's like it's the same underlying fabric that's providing a consistent experience, which is so again, it's a weird argument to make, but I'm saying I think if the game were positioned differently, you might feel differently about it.
It's a good point. And by the way, shameless plug here. William's book, The Book of Esports, has a ton about business models and games and how the two things are tied together. So make
So
sure
much.
you go read that and leave a review on Amazon, guys, because it is it does give you structure to think about some of these conversations we're having, which I think is interesting. And these conversations aren't going to go away, right?
No.
Like we're going to see a ton of changes, innovation, I think, in business models, where I think, to William's point, I think we are going to see more and more studios move to free to play because everyone's just, if you just look at the guy next door seeing it work, you're obviously tempted to do it yourself. And I think there's pressure, especially for public companies like Ubisoft, to emulate what the success stories look like.
Yep, completely.
William, before we get to the next topic, I just have one quick word. You guys know one of the fastest growing segments of the esports market is betting. You don't need to be the prophet to know that. One of the companies I'm most excited about in the space is Esports Entertainment Group. It's a NASDAQ listed company. They're fully regulated. The ticker symbol is GMBL. I definitely recommend checking them out. If you're looking to invest in the space, if you're looking to play in esports, they've got a great stack of products and a great company, esportsentertainmentgroup.com, ticker symbol GMBL. Having said that, I'm not selling any securities. This is not any recommendation to buy stock. I'm not an investment advisor. Go seek out professional advice if you're looking to invest in the field. William, let's talk about a story that, we talked a little bit. We've talked about this multiple times before.
Yep.
And a big segment of the gaming market seems to be, like, from a business standpoint, gaming chairs.
Yes.
And
love
this
me
has come
some
up
gaming
multiple
chairs.
times. We've had Matt Hillman, who created Mavix chairs. Like, we've had even guests on the podcast centered around gaming chairs. And so then I see this story in High Snob, I can't even pronounce it, highsnobiety.com. And the headline here is, Herman Miller has quietly cornered the luxury gaming chair market. And it's an interview, okay? It's a white paper or an interview with John Campbell, who's director of gaming at Herman Miller. And what's interesting is they talk about their Aeron chair, the collaboration with Logitech, etc. And I think what's interesting is the title here is so fascinating that in a nascent market like gaming, growing market like gaming, where if you look at gaming chairs in sort of that mid segment, call it $500 and under, right? There are probably a dozen, at least, manufacturers of gaming chairs that we could point to that are all doing well, right? All have very sustainable businesses in the space. But when you look at the high end, there's literally nothing there except Herman Miller. And they've managed to consume all the oxygen, all the mind share around high-end gaming. And I'm curious, like, why you think that is. And do we think this high end of gaming furniture, let's call it in general, is now like a market that is impossible to break into as a consequence. Like, I'm curious how you feel about it, especially in the context of Herman Miller being not like an avant-garde, gaming brand either. This is like a furniture studio that was founded in 1905.
Like, the thing to say here is, I wonder if there's a simple argument to discuss. I wonder if it's just a case of quality wins. You know what I mean? Like, this is a market that's won by quality. Because you've always said so consistently, Paul, and it's really you I take the lead from, that Herman Miller is just the best and nobody can touch them. And, don't even think that you stand a chance because Herman Miller's the future. And
I have two. Like, I'm sitting on one, and I have another one right here.
And yeah, it's like, and this might be a case of, look, like, you use your gaming chair a lot, right? Like, a lot, right? And you're probably a pretty good judge of if your chair is comfortable or not. You know what I mean? Like, could this just be a simple scenario of, look, like, you have a very educated consumer base that's able to discern quality. You have a case where the manufacturer has so much experience doing really comfy chairs, like, that fundamentally there's strong crossover between office and gaming, right? So they have a big quality advantage out of the gate. Like, is it not just the market solves itself, and that's a win? And I'm not trying to disparage other gaming chairs. I don't know. I mean, but I definitely get the sense, at least from you, that Herman Miller is just so far and away above everyone else, right?
I think what's interesting to me is yes, but I think they've bucked the trend in marketing in this space, which has been like, we got to get Courage and Valkyrie to sit in the chair, and then we have to run ads on Twitch, and
we got to give it a
hold
new name, like
tournament, like
the Lemon Dragon chair. Like, it's like,
and the latest like Valorant tournament sponsored by Herman Miller, and like and yes, they've done marketing with some key partners. I think they did all the, I think it was Team Liquid in their facility, whatever, that they put their chairs, like that, or and they partnered with Logitech, so there was that. But it hasn't been like the kind of flash, big influencer, big tournament, big they
typical...
weren't
like airdropping Herman Miller chairs into the League of Legends finals. You know what I mean? Like, but
is there some takeaway from that maybe the way everyone sort of thinks we need to reach gamers is maybe not entirely the only way, at least.
It's interesting because a few people have said to me over the years, and I'm going to paraphrase here, but something to the effect of, everybody thinks gaming is a marketing-driven industry, and it's the exact opposite, right? And I think this is a really, like, and those comments have kind of swirled because they've been people I've respected who've basically said that. And they point to all the pageantry, right? Like, all the performance, all the stuff you're talking about, like, the ridiculous sponsorships and everything. And that has such high visibility. People believe that drives, but that, what these people said to me, again, sort of paraphrasing here, is the reality is gamers know what they like, and gamers are smart people with strong tastes, and you can't, like, this isn't a group where, like, you can market. It's not like marketing them cleaning wipes and, like, is one wipe really better than the other? Like, it's basically brand awareness and what's at eye level in the store. You know what I mean? This is a case where, like if I tell you any game, let's use games as an example because you have a very strong opinion about it, right? If I tell you, hey, Paul, let's go play Valorant, you're going to be tugging me to play Apex Legends right away, and you're going to give me, like, and every gamer is like that. And that level of knowledge doesn't need to stop at the games themselves. It can go far, far deeper than that, right? I mean, even with you, think about when we did the audio setup for this podcast, and you were like, oh, don't buy that mic. That mic, that's trash. You know what I mean? You got to do this. And, like, there's a real expertise and domain expertise that gamers really have. And again, because gamers really do use the things they're purchasing, like keyboards, mice, all of this stuff, and they're cognizant, like, you have such immediate loops in gaming of your own performance. like they have a very strong sense of what works and what doesn't. And so, the argument I'd have here would be, sort of, so if you take that as a view, yeah, maybe what these people are telling me, sort of paraphrase over the years is true, is like you can do all this marketing and it can buy you some short-term traction. It can certainly do things like create categories. Like, let's be honest, I think it took marketing to convince people that gaming chairs should be a thing, right? Like, I don't think we would have got there. But at the end of the day, because you're dealing with an educated consumer, the quality factor wins. If you have the best product, as long as you do enough to put that product in a consumer's consideration set, that's all you need to do, because the consumer will take care of it themselves, right? I don't know. It's interesting, but
it is an interesting thought. And it's like, to me, I see multiple trends sort of converging with this Herman Miller story, right? Which is, you see, call it older, more traditional brands dipping their toes into gaming, doing like XYZ for gamers, right? In the same way Herman Miller did the M-Body chair, which I have, the original, and I have the Logitech one behind me, right? They did this version for gamers.
Yeah.
But also they've hung on to sort of their more traditional Herman Miller, obviously quality, but marketing as well, right? It's not like Herman Miller was never the flashy marketer in general, right?
No.
People who knew the brand, loved the brand, bought the brand, but it's not like they were running Super Bowl ads or, like it just wasn't, it's not their DNA as a company. And so I see these trends of like, you're right, very authentic, kind of appealing to an educated gaming consumer, but also this sort of parallel path of like traditional brands making stuff for gamers. And I think the brands that figure out sort of the balance between the for gamer while still maintaining what made their brand, successful or special in the first place are the ones who are going to win.
The very thing about Herman Miller is they did not rip off the Herman Miller branding, right? Like,
correct.
I think I even said it was a mistake at the time. I thought they needed to have a new brand and they could put a powered by Herman Miller or from the makers of Herman or whatever on it to create the, the lineage. But I thought it was a mistake. But again, and again, like, I mean, almost that underscores the whole point. Like, if I were going to pitch you in a VC meeting, hey, I'm going to give you an awesome, gaming chair here, and the competitors are called DX Racer. And like, I don't know, what's another one, like Aurora, and like, and mine's going to be called Herman.
Titan Lab.
Yeah. Mine's going to be called Herman. Like, you'd be like, what? And I'd be like, no, it's great. And people are going to associate it with office furniture. And you'd be like, you're done. Get out of here. Leave. But, all that says, I can't believe, I still stand by, I can't believe those weren't drags on the business. I can't believe those weren't drags. Because if they had an inferior product quality and it was called Herman and your first association was an office, you wouldn't buy that chair either. It must be something to do with the underlying fundamentals of the comfort of the chair.
On that note, William, that wraps up this week's podcast. Thank you as always. And for those of you listening, just a couple of things. One, as always, make sure to check out, we do an after show live stream, guys, after we tape the podcast every Wednesday evening at 8:30 p.m. Eastern time. It's a lot of fun. It's more interactive. You get to ask questions. You get to participate. And we love doing it because we get to interact with you. So make sure to check that out Wednesday evenings, 8:30 p.m. Eastern time everywhere. So like LinkedIn Live, YouTube. Make sure, obviously, to follow us on all our socials. LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok. It's all Biz Esports or Business of Esports. And if you haven't already, go leave a review on the Book of Esports on Amazon. It's an incredible book. If you haven't bought it or read it already, do that first. Go leave a review. I know William would appreciate it. And as always, guys, we will see you next week.